Hey, Alicia Novin here. When it comes to writing code, I think that I'm a very intentional developer. And I think that that word intentional is very key. So I wanted to give 4 different ways where you can also be more intentional about how you write code. Here we go. I really like the word intentional. For me, being intentional means a lot more than just simply meaning to do something the way that you do it. And for that reason, the opposite of intentional wouldn't therefore be intentional. It would be being uninformed or being apathetic. So intentional development, that would be an approach where the why behind your choices, the why around the decisions of why you've structured things the way it is. Anyone who's looking at that immediately knows the answers to that why. And there's very little room for confusion. They're not having to interpret a lot. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your code is self-documenting, but it's more that your code leaves them with all the answers and not a bunch of questions. So the opposite, like I said, would therefore be uninformed or apathetic. Now, uninformed, that just simply means you don't yet know the right way of doing something, and so that's a treatable problem. Once you become informed, you're going to therefore then make intentional choices, or alternatively, you'll be apathetic and make the apathetic choice. And that's where I think the real danger is. If you're apathetic about your development, it means that you're cutting corners and you're being maybe dismissive about established patterns, either because you think that they don't matter a whole lot, or you feel justified in cutting those corners for the time being because it means faster delivery. And if it's that latter, unfortunately, not accounting for all that cleanup work, all that stuff that's going to come later, means that really you're just adding to your technical debt, and so you're not saving a lot of time in the long run. So with all that in mind, let's talk about 4 different things that you can do to be a more intentional developer. Here we go. Let's start with a simple one, which, despite being simple, unfortunately I see far too many people cut corners around it. And it has to do with just simply using the correct data type. You know, whether you're ingesting a file that's a CSV, or you have an interface and the user is putting in a date and a time into a text box, and that's going to get sent across the wire as a string, you want to accept it as a date-time object. You always want to use the type that best represents the value and the meaning of that value. So whether it's currency or fractions or percentages or a date time, you always want to use the correct type. And the nice part is that converting from one type to another is pretty trivial, but it also bakes in the validation because that final type only accepts values of a certain kind. And so ultimately your code becomes more maintainable and there's less risk of errors. And interestingly, it's also more inclusive because it supports internationalization and accessibility out of the box when you're using the right kind of type. But ultimately, you never want to have someone wondering why that date time is stored as a string, or why you have a float or a double when all you're needing is integers. Having that kind of confusion will just create more problems in your code, or at least it leaves them with more questions. So besides being more error prone, they'll be wondering if they've missed something in your code, and they'll have to then go ask you about it, or they'll have to see what is in the data that would cause you to use the wrong type. So simply put, use the best type that will represent the values that you'll receive and the meaning of those values. I already spoke about types, but I wanted to revisit the topic when talking about a collection of information or a collection of data. So again, when it comes to lists or arrays, you always want to use the correct type. So whether it's a fixed length array or a multi-dimensional array or a hash table with key value pairs, or if you're in C# and you are deciding between using a list or an observable collection, whatever it might be, one thing that really helps is knowing that all of these things exist and knowing why these things exist. Because when you use the correct thing, especially for more complicated objects, it will save you from writing a lot of unnecessary code because those objects will either optimize for what you're trying to do, or there might be some of the logic baked into those types so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I definitely recommend reading about the 4 principles of object-oriented programming if you're not familiar with them. I want to focus on encapsulation and around that topic. So generally, you should try to declare things at the lowest level of scope as possible. So let's say you have a variable and you only need it within an if block inside a function. You should then define that variable inside the if block, not at the function level. Or let's say you have a variable that you need across the entire class, but only internal to that class. Well, define it at the class level, but make the accessor private so that nothing else beyond that class can see it or use it. So, good rule of thumb, start with the lowest level of access and the lowest level of scope, and only increase it if you think it makes sense architecturally. There's an important paradigm in delivering agile software while following lean principles. And it's basically to never over-engineer by building features unless there's an explicit business need. You never want to build logic in anticipation of it one day being used. And that'll help reduce bloat, it'll reduce the risk of technical debt, and it cuts at the heart of what it means to be an intentional developer. So imagine you have a new person joining the team and they think you've always been intentional with how you write code. And they come across some code that's not in active use. They'll be left with a ton of questions to figure out why it is the way that it is. And worse yet, if they are in charge of maintaining that code base, anytime they go and make changes to other areas that are in use, they'll have to go back and maintain that code that nothing is using. So it's just complete wasted effort by both you and them. So in short, sometimes being an intentional coder means not coding at all or being very careful about what you do right. When it comes to being an intentional developer, there's a whole lot more that I can talk about, but I want to leave it there. Because if you're new in your career and you're trying to just be more confident about your day-to-day craft, being an intentional developer is pretty tricky to do for where you're at right now. But that day will come. As you learn more, as you become more informed, it'll lead you down the path of becoming more intentional or more apathetic. And I hope you'll become more intentional. So just know that all of these things will come with time as you become more experienced, but you'll want to make sure you're not cutting corners and not being sloppy, but instead using your code as a way to communicate to others who will ultimately consume your code why you're structuring things the way that you are, so that they know that there's a method to the madness and they'll be able to better understand your code. So I hope you found this helpful. Definitely would love to hear your comments on it. And I'll lastly just mention my podcast called Increments, where I'm, if you'll pardon the pun, more intentionally focused on aspects about growing in a technology role and how we can create the space for thinking about things like fear and growth and anxiety around being in the technology space. I hope you'll check it out. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and thanks a lot.